Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness, and Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about vulnerability. Vulnerability is so important, but also very scary. So, Donovan, where would you like to kick off this conversation?
So the first thing that comes to mind for me around vulnerability is basically I think the conversation will be useful as it pertains to communication, right? Like being vulnerable as a person in terms of like I don't know, opening yourself up to things that may be risky or whatever else as actions is probably generally not that useful of a thing, like becoming vulnerable in those terms. But becoming vulnerable in terms of like the ways that you communicate or potentially the way that you like set up situations. I think there's just like more mileage there. And one of the things that comes to mind for me, and we can get into this, is sort of vulnerability is something that I think can be a tricky line for people to walk, because the difference between being vulnerable and being whiny can be unclear to some people at some times, right? So by that, I mean, if you have someone who is like, oh, today sucked, my life sucks, this thing sucks, like you can end up in a place that it comes across as very negative as opposed to vulnerability. So maybe we can tease out some of those pieces, because I've been in situations where someone is being very negative all the time and they're like, oh, but I'm just trying to share, my situation with you and be more vulnerable. So those are many different angles that we could approach from. I'll let you chime in where you want to.
Yeah, I didn't even, that's a really good way of thinking about it. It didn't even occur to me to think of it as whiny, but I could see how maybe people could think that, or it might come across as that if someone's sharing something a little more like, is it complaining or is it actually being vulnerable? And I guess for me, the distinction would be vulnerable is like you're actually putting yourself at risk for something. And that might be like telling someone I love you for the first time is pretty scary. I actually have been hooked on, I might have mentioned it in the last few podcasts. I don't even remember, but I've been hooked on, what is the show called? Married at First Sight. Yeah, it's really trashy reality TV. But yeah, some guy, like, it's crazy to think that like people are they're willing to risk like marrying a complete stranger, but for whatever reason some people like in the process they're married for 8 weeks of the social experiment. And some of them like really struggle with the I love you is like scarier than marrying a stranger to some degree. So I think it's like something that maybe is hard for you to share. Oh, I don't know. That's hard to say. But that's my initial thought is like you're putting yourself at risk. And by sharing and being vulnerable, it helps you be more connected with people versus whining or complaining kind of creates more distance with people around you, I think. But I guess it depends on the receiver too. Like some people feel more connected if you're being more emotional and expressive, but other people are uncomfortable with that emotional expressiveness and they might regress or retreat in that. So I think there's a lot of variables.
Yeah, so as you're talking about that, I was sort of thinking, for me at least, some of the times that I've seen people, so the thing that comes to mind like very often is people saying like, oh, you need to be more vulnerable, right? Like that's something that I feel like is very common to hear or is said. And I feel like kind of like you started talking about, like the context makes a huge difference as to what that really means, and I guess the way that people interpret it. So I think you're right in the sense of there are certain ways of communicating things that are vulnerable, but the payoff or potential is valuable. right? So like you were saying, like if you tell someone you love them, right, there's some vulnerability there in terms of you may not be able to know what their reaction will be, but also, there is sort of this idea of like you have to put the idea out there to see what the response is, to see if like if it's a relationship that you want to move forward with, or to sort of gauge where the other person is at. So there's some like risk and vulnerability in that. And then there are other sort of topics or ways of being vulnerable, which I think are sharing authentic experiences, right? When I think of like sort of the opposite of being vulnerable, it's sort of like locking down some of the things that are true and authentic to you. And it sort of, I think, follows the same pattern in terms of when you share those things out, you may not know what the reaction of the other person is going to be. So like one thing that comes to mind is like the vulnerability of talking about maybe an abortion or something like that, where depending on your audience, you may not know what sort of reception you're going to get.
Right.
And sort of opening up. So I think one of the areas that I kind of want to talk about more is, I feel like it's so common to hear like, oh, you should try to be more vulnerable and open up and those things. But I don't know off the top of my head if that's always a good thing, right? I don't know if that's always the appropriate way to move through life. Like, for example, speaking about something like abortion in a group where you know that you're only going to get met with negative reactions,
Right.
and you have nothing to gain. Like, you don't stand to get anything from talking about it. I don't know. Curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that there's a time and a place, and it really depends on the environment. If you feel safe, I guess it's kind of like it kind of comes hand in hand with trust, which you don't really know until you're being vulnerable to some degree, or how it's going to receive. Like maybe you can anticipate it's going to be received poorly, or maybe it's going to be received really well. And it's hard to say. And it's kind of like, I guess not trusting the other person per se, but just trusting that however it goes down, that you'll be able to deal with it, however it is. And just maybe, I don't even want to say like trust your intuition, because it's like your fear might hold you back from like sharing, and like is when you might think that's your intuition, but what is your intuition? So I'm just like, oh, that's a tricky one. Yeah, I'm a little stumped.
Yeah, because I feel like, and I don't know, maybe it's just a blanket statement of being more vulnerable that I'm like skeptical of, right? Just because I've heard it so many times, and it seems like it's a tool to be used for specific circumstances. So I'm thinking like, okay, if I'm meeting a group of strangers, and if I have in my head like be more vulnerable,
Right.
probably shouldn't jump off the deep end and unload like some of the heaviest things. I mean, you can. Go ahead.
Unless it's like a space created for that. Like, I think I might have talked about the Death Cafe, where it's just a bunch of strangers getting together to talk about a very vulnerable topic, is death. And it's like the nature of the topic and the environment is inviting you to have like those deeper, more intimate conversations. So people are being vulnerable, but then you like almost instantly feel connected with a group of strangers. But like other contexts, like it's like, oh, I just met my coworkers for I just started this new job, and you're just like sharing all this, and I don't know, maybe it depends on the job or the environment, but it might not be the time and place. It's like you got to build up some more rapport, and you have to maintain your professionalism too. So it's kind of that judgment call that you have to make with that kind of thing.
And now that we're talking about it more, I'm also thinking vulnerability is sort of maybe this idea of throwing something out there to potentially further connection, but it's vulnerable because the person may or may not be aligned with you. So if you come into it sort of more open to whatever their reaction or opinion is, you'll probably be better served, as opposed to, when I think about it, there are times that I've been vulnerable, what I would call vulnerable. And I sort of secretly had a wish that the person would agree with me or be on the same side as me or support me or whatever else. And it, whenever it didn't turn out that way, I feel like I was like extra hurt, right? Because it was like,
Yeah.
oh, there's this sensitive topic and I want this person to be on the same side as me. And then, oh,
Right.
they're not. That violated my expectations. Now I'm double hurt.
Yeah.
So I'm also kind of
Yeah.
thinking like, for some of these conversations, like, you throw out this bid for connection or whatnot, but if you can try to keep your mind open, and for some of the topics it's hard, but try to keep your mind open and leave space for them to share their opinions and whatnot, whether or not they align with yours, that might help. But then again, I'm also thinking like there's other times I've been vulnerable and then I learned the actual position of someone else, and it greatly reduced our connection because I felt like, oh, like we are not the same kind of person, or like we're not aligned on values, or we're not whatever else. So I would be curious if that would have helped or not. But I do think coming into some of these conversations, adding more space might be helpful. I'm going to try that in the future.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because I think if you come in at it with like no expectations, you don't know how that person's going to react, but just it's in a way kind of giving yourself the freedom to express yourself without, like, it's kind of overcoming the hurdle, the fear of like, you don't know what's going to be on the other side. You don't know what the reaction is being, but you do it and then you find out, and it might be great. It might be not so great. I actually, the thought that came into my mind is like, maybe like gay or transgender LGBTQ like community coming out to their parents. I haven't had that experience personally, but I have had several friends that have, and their parents' reactions are across the board. Some disown them, some like embrace them, some didn't think it was a big deal and they already knew. So it's just, you don't know how it's going to be, but it's a big milestone, and it's kind of like a way to just become more fully self-expressed in a way.
Yeah, and I think on a related note, we've been talking about sort of there are these conversations that can be had that are risky or can bear some potentially negative consequences.
Right.
I also think there's another angle to look at vulnerability in terms of sort of an emotional outlet, right? If I think about like a stereotypical man who is not vulnerable at all, right? It's like this idea of a person, and it doesn't have to be a man, idea of a person who doesn't talk about any of their feelings or any of the things that are authentic to them, right? They're sort of plastered on this face of like, oh, things are fine, or, whatever sort of mood they carry around, but without getting into the details of anything important to them. I also think there's some value in, like if you have cultivated relationships, making sure that you have outlets to be vulnerable on specific topics that may or may not be available for you everywhere. So by that I mean, like if one of those things that you're is important to you, or that you care deeply about, or sort of like you think it's a secret, or whatever else, whatever the topic is, I'll just stick with abortion, right?
Yeah.
Like if you don't think you can have that conversation with certain people, I think it's really valuable and important to make sure that you find a place that you can be vulnerable about that, because otherwise these emotions can just kind of like sit there and brood and stir and cause all sorts of other problems.
Right.
So it may be, at least part of this conversation is more about finding the places where you can exhibit vulnerability so that you do have some of those emotional outlets. And then of course, there's this piece that we've been talking about like pushing the boundaries, but I don't think it always has to be in that bucket, as long as you have a place to sort of flush out some of these ideas and feelings.
Yeah, no, I think that's really valuable insight you offered, because it's like, in the example of an abortion, if someone were to go through it, maybe their parents don't accept it, maybe their church doesn't accept it, whatever it might be. But it's a pretty significant thing to go through, and there's a whole lot of emotions involved. And so finding people that you feel safe to share that, or maybe who's been through it themselves, whether it's like an online forum or a friend of a friend that you've heard who's been through it. I think that's really valuable in itself. I actually have a question for you, because I was another like what popped into my head was, I think it was like season 4 or 5 of Married at First Sight, and there's this guy that like the wife keeps like harassing him, like, be more open, be more vulnerable, and he hears this all the time because I guess he's not very, but he doesn't know how. I think, and it's his frustration. He's like, I don't, and then he like flips out. He's like, I don't know, like, I'm gonna freak out if you ask me one more time because I don't know how to do that exactly. So like my idea was, you know, yes, if you want someone to be more vulnerable, you have to be a little more clear of what that looks like, and maybe that's asking questions. And there's like, you know, there's card games, there's question books of like ways to draw out more vulnerability and openness through the nature of the question, rather than just being like open statement, just be more open and vulnerable. And like, do you get frustrated with that sometimes, Donovan? Like, does that happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I have a lot of personal experience with that exact scenario, but there are plenty of parallels that I can think of that are just as frustrating, or at least not useful, right? So, you know, if you're having some sort of conflict and the other person is like, you need to be nicer.
Right.
Well, there are a multitude of ways that you can interpret that. So
Right.
that's what makes it difficult when you know, let's say we're having like the interactions between us, and you say like, you know what, you're closed off all the time, you need to be more open. And I'm like, okay. And then I try to start doing that, but
Right.
by my definition, and then I think I'm doing it, and you're like, oh, you're still closed off, you need to be more open. And it's like, well, what do you actually want? I need a more detailed answer. So basically what I'm getting at is you can end up with things like this, like you need to be more vulnerable, or you need to be nicer, or whatever else, where the definition of what that means for the person, for each person, can differ, and you need to get closer together on what that means, right?
Right.
So if in this hypothetical example, if you want me to be more vulnerable, do you mean you want me to talk more about like my past or my childhood or something? Do you want me to talk more about my emotions? Do you want me to talk more about you know, sort of like goals or aspirations, or like how my interactions have been with other people, right? Like you need to sort of hone in on the types of behaviors that actually exhibit that trait for you. And I definitely have had frustrations or challenges with not the word vulnerability, but
Mhm.
other topics that are sort of broad like this in the past.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, and I think it's a two-way street in that, like, yeah, the person might want to be vulnerable and open, but you also, if you're wanting your partner to be more open and vulnerable, you have to create that space. You need to dial in clearly like what that looks like. What exactly do you want to know? Like, ask that. Dive in deeper, or start working with, you know, some professionals to help you open that door a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's both ways. And as you know, don't expect someone to just like share their whole life story off the get-go on a first date or anything like that. Just like, it's a matter of building the trust, so over time hopefully more vulnerability can happen, and more connection can happen.
It also goes both ways in terms of preferences, right?
That's
Like
true. Yeah.
sometimes a person's communication style or preferred communication style doesn't involve them wanting to talk about emotions or finding it like
Mhm.
easy or natural.
Right.
Now, we're probably both on the same page that in general, that's probably a useful thing to get your head around, get more in tune with your emotions, be able to sort of at least identify and communicate about them at a
Totally.
base level. But I've also, as far as vulnerability goes, there's also been some tangential conversations I've had that people are asking for something that I don't necessarily have, which is to
Mhm.
say, like, oh, like I need more details on that. I need more of the feeling behind that. I need more of
Mhm.
whatever else. And sort of it's been like, well, you know, as far as what my internal experience is, I have communicated to the best of my ability what's going on.
Right.
So sometimes I've also found that it's like somebody who's doing the polling is
Mm.
looking for something that may not necessarily be there. Now, again, it's sort of this tango between two people and
Yeah.
figuring out communication styles and preferences and all that kind of stuff. But that is another thing I've run into where it's like, you need to open up about this specific aspect, or like, tell me how you got to this conclusion or why you feel this specific way. And there have been times where either I don't have it in terms of the experience wasn't there, or I don't have it in terms of like, I'm not clear on it. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
can't answer this for you because it's not clear in my head the way that I would communicate this. For example, there's been times where I like feel frustrated and really
Mm-hmm.
tight and just like whatever else, but I don't know why, right? There's a
Mm,
million reasons it could be,
totally.
but I've had it be like, well, why are you frustrated? And it's like, I don't know. Like the depth of the experience I can get to is the feeling that's present.
Mm.
I would tell you if I knew, but I just like feel this way. So that's another thing that I've run into.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that made me think of, if someone was pulling me to be more vulnerable or trying, like, I can like intellectually talk about it, but I might not be able to connect to that emotion because my emotions, I don't know what emotional state I will be in when I'm sharing. I could share about my miscarriage and totally be fine. And then other moments I can like burst out in tears and barely like say anything. So it really varies. And I think the other person would have to understand that, if they're closed off all the time and they never like express any type of emotion ever, that's something to work on, but to also be understanding that emotions kind of are in flux and you can't necessarily control them. And it's just a matter of like the other actually here's an example from last night. We went to like this outdoor concert thing at like this bar, local bar kind of a thing. And it was great. I was feeling good and having a great time. And then just like out of the blue, I just started feeling kind of depressed. I just don't know. I was just like overthinking like things going on in my life. And I was just like, it just shifted my mood. And my partner was trying to be helpful and be like, oh, such a great time and just like have a positive outlook. And I was like, that's not helpful. And I just kind of snapped at him and he didn't react so well to that. So it kind of turned the mood of the evening. But I guess the moral of the story is that you don't know when those emotions are going to hit. But I kind of explained myself when we got home that, this is what happened like on an emotional level. And I'm sorry that I snapped and I had no intention of hurting you. I was just kind of like, this is the emotional state I was dealing with. So I couldn't be maybe vulnerable in that moment because I was just like dealing in my internal state. But after the fact, I could share a little more about it. And I think that helped us feel connected because it was like, he could see that, he didn't have to take it personally. It wasn't about that. It was just like a random shift in my mood and emotions essentially.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's also important, which is between any two people, when you're in a relationship, finding out sort of the patterns of when certain types of communication are going to be useful, or at least trying to patch things up as quickly as possible. Like you said, like in the moment, it was difficult because you were feeling those emotions to communicate out sort of the base of some of those things, and you were in a reactive state.
Right.
And then later you were able to like break it down a little bit more and add some more context and whatnot. And I think that's really important because I've also seen or been in situations where it's like when one or both people is in that reactive state, the other person is pushing for like, you need to give me more details, you have to be more open.
Mm-hmm.
And pushing in a context like that where things are already starting to get heated
Mm-hmm.
often just makes things more heated.
Yeah.
So there's also a piece around um, requesting or trying to get vulnerability when not just the relationship is right, but like the situation for that relationship is right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was really helpful because we had a conversation like a few days prior to be like, I know I had to specify that I knew his intentions were good and that, to not take it personally. Cause like, I think in the past, you might have like try to argue that I should have received it better than I did. And I think he's learned that, arguing his point of view in that moment is not going to help me feel better and it's just going to escalate into a fight. So he was able to kind of step back and not take it personally and be like, okay, she needs a little space, and she's struggling with her emotions right now, and I'm just going to be here supportive in the way that she asks instead of like the way that he thinks he should. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Like setting sort of that foundation for, I don't know, I guess just that piece of communication.
Yeah.
I did have another question I wanted to ask you, a topic I want to open up, which is like, let's say hypothetically you meet someone new.
Okay.
What are the sorts of behaviors or traits that allow you to feel like you could be more vulnerable, with the undercurrent of being like,
Mm.
what can we do to help people feel more comfortable? But I think me asking you what other people can do will help open that up.
Mm. This is what I thought of was that, like dating in my 20s versus my 30s, I think I was more superficial in my conversations when I was getting to know people. It was like, oh, what do you do for work? What are your hobbies? And and also I thought more of my dates in my 20s were boring because of that. But I think it was just in my 30s when I was back in the dating realm, I think I was more open and vulnerable and expressive because I think I just cared less what people thought. Maybe that helped. Of just letting go of like, they might think I'm a weirdo and that's okay, but I'm just going to be fully self-expressed, and I'm going to ask questions that actually kind of might be more vulnerable for both of us to get to know each other, just because I found that more interesting of a conversation, and it helped create more connection in my mind. Like I would ask, like, what's your relationship like with your parents? That's more interesting to me than what do you do for work? Or what are your hopes and dreams and aspirations? Like, what do you want out of life? What legacy do you want to leave? Like something a little deeper uh can elicit a little more vulnerability. And I think what helps me is what I've realized is like, if I see the other person struggling to be vulnerable, creating a safe, non-judgmental space for them. But also I've noticed that if I'm vulnerable first, that gives them like space to be vulnerable too. They might not, it might take a while, but I know if I share something like really personal, most of the time, I mean, maybe once in a while people are like, whoa, TMI. But I think most of the time it's well received, or I have enough insight to be like, I think this would be okay to share. And usually I think it is. So
Yeah, I've found in my experience that as you're developing a relationship of any kind,
right.
it sort of naturally, most of the time, naturally evolves in terms of slowly sharing more and more personal or vulnerable things
Mm.
until one person or both people find something that they're like not accepting on, right? Until some sort of reaction becomes negative.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that has helped me at least cultivate some allowance for vulnerability in my relationships. Is I used to be, well, I still have strong opinions, but I used to react strongly to
Mm.
people sharing certain things, right? And I used to feel much more um or like aggressive towards like, oh my god, you believe this thing? Like, are you kidding me? Like this and this, like it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And over time, uh I've been able to deepen relationships by like leaving so much space
Mm.
for whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like there have been some things in the last couple of years since I've been working on this that when I hear them initially, like my gut reaction is like, I really need to push back hard against this.
Yeah.
But I know from even further past that like that's not going to, one, it's not going to change their mind. Like that's not going to sway their opinion at all. But two, it has a good chance of tanking or reducing the strength of the relationship. Now
Mm.
that doesn't mean I need to like agree with everyone and like, oh
Oh.
wow, that's such a good opinion that we should get rid of everyone. Like I don't necessarily agree with the people, but being much more what, not affirmative, but like acknowledging what
Mm.
people are saying, right? Regardless of what it is, especially when it's a sensitive topic, especially when you're paying attention to cues like there's a lot of people who don't like their job or the field of work that they're in. That's one
Mhm.
example. So people will say something like, "Oh, I'm just a server or whatever else," finding both a place to sort of acknowledge that, and if it makes sense,
Hmm.
support people through that, I found are ways that can really open up vulnerability, because I think for a lot of these topics, people are so used to negative reactions or dismissive reactions that they sort of steel themselves against it, or they have so much internal conflict and strife about whatever the thing is
Hmm.
that they're ready to beat themselves up about it. So, like when I found that when I'm able to keep that space, keep support where it makes sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, regardless of what the job is, like a job wouldn't exist if it didn't provide some value. But like honing in on things like that has allowed me to deepen a lot more relationships than I was able to in the past.
Hmm.
And in the same way, when I am talking to someone new and I share something somewhat personal and the reaction is supportive or at least given space to, I feel much more comfortable sharing more things, as opposed to when I share something and the reaction is fairly negative. Like,
Totally.
we've talked about me making rap music a couple times. Like
Hmm.
that's a, I mean, I don't feel like particularly vulnerable about that, but that's a good one to highlight because the reactions are so varied, right? Some people are like, oh, that's interesting. Like I wouldn't have thought that. That's really cool. Other people are like, what? Like you almost definitely make stuff that's bad. Like you shouldn't be pursuing that. And the difference in those
Hmm.
reactions obviously colors what I'm willing to share on other topics, because if they're that negative on something so shallow, like
Hmm.
uh no reason to go deeper.
Yeah, yeah. So kind of like what I'm hearing from you, and I totally agree with this, is that, if you create a space where the person, you don't have to agree with them, but creating a space where they can feel heard and understood and not so judged so harshly,
Mhm.
even if your opinion differs, that creates more space for people to be more vulnerable and do it more frequently, versus like the, even though your gut reaction might be like, ooh, ooh. Yeah, I think what helps me is, you know being curious and being like, huh, that's interesting that they think that is very different of how I think. I wonder what led them to think that. What was their upbringing like, or what were their parents like, or what was their education like to have them lead to this way of thinking. And that kind of gives me space to not be so reactive to whatever thing that they might be saying too.
Yeah, 100%. This isn't exactly vulnerability, but
Yeah.
it's setting the stage for it for someone
Yeah.
else. And one example that comes to mind is there was somebody that told me, what did they say? They were like, the number one thing you have to do in your financial life is pay off your house as quickly as possible. And my gut was like, that's not right. Like, if you're paying off your house faster and you have a, I don't know, 4% interest rate, the
Mhm.
amount of money that you're making on paying it off is 4%. There are a lot of other investments that can pull in more than 4%. So it doesn't make any sense. But in this specific conversation, using some of the things that you talked about, I was
Yeah.
like, okay, interesting. I don't agree with that. I'm
Right.
curious why you're saying that, or what led you to think that's the right thing. And then the person explained, like, well, once you get rid of your house payment, you don't really have any expenses, and then you're freed up to do whatever you want. And it's like, okay, so
Hmm.
the way they're thinking is from sort of a safety or security mindset,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to like an absolute money maximization type of mindset, right? And once I understood that, like this judgment of just like, oh wow, like that is not the optimal strategy to make the most money,
True.
switch to like, oh, sure, if the most important thing for you is security, that might make sense, because once you don't have a house payment, you don't have a house payment. Like paying
Which
for
that's
somewhere to
kind of
live is
nice.
expensive, and it's most of what eats
Right.
up your cash month to
Yeah.
month. So again, not like a super vulnerable topic, but
Yeah.
it's that's the sort of interaction that I feel like, as you have more of those, you open more space for more vulnerable topics in your relationships.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And yeah, that path might be right for some people and might not be right for other people. Like some people who are too afraid to, like, because the more, like, to make money sometimes involves a lot of risk. So it's like, ooh, maybe they don't want to go that route. So paying off debt is a safer route than like gambling it and then maybe making tons of money or not. It's like actually the what is it? The Powerball is up to like $1 billion right now. It's ridiculous.
Is it? Oh, that's wild.
I know. I was like, man, so nobody's won the lottery, I guess, in a few tries. So it's built up to $1 billion. I'm like, oh my goodness. But I mean, my recommendation is don't expect that to be how you make your, your money. But for another person, it might be, yeah. So it's like difference of opinion, and we can all honor each other's opinions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, just going back to the vulnerability part, one of the big things for me is just like, maybe it doesn't make sense to be vulnerable at every depth in every situation, but exposing some of it can help have like develop more meaningful relationships. And really the part for me that I found value in working on is being able to cultivate an environment for other people to be more vulnerable. Because even if I share something vulnerable and it doesn't go well, if I create the space for other people to be vulnerable and feel good about it, that relationship is likely to be positive, at least from their end to me, right? Like at least other people will feel good that they can share those things. And that's obviously I'm not 100% at it, but something that I think is worth striving for and something that's largely in my control to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of made me think of like the last thing I want to add to this conversation is that, when I think about my own emotional and personal development and journey, it's, I've gotten a lot better at being vulnerable. So I want people to recognize that it can be like it's like a muscle you exercise, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. And then the less you care about how that reaction is going to be. So, I don't expect people to do a 180, just go from like stone cold to like crying, bawling their eyes out all the time. It was a journey, but now I feel like, I can cry fairly easily, from a movie or even things like that. And I have no problems with it. Whereas like in the past, in my early 20s, it was much more of a struggle. So that's the last little bit I wanted to add.
The last thing I want to add, and then I'll be done, is I feel like for me, a lot of the vulnerability is about expressing myself in a way that's authentic. And when I think about when I was younger, like in my teenage years, and I would say that I wasn't being vulnerable, it's because I was expressing myself in a way that I thought would be pleasing to other people and also wasn't authentic, right? Now that I'm a little bit older, I found a better balance around like expressing myself in ways that are authentic and potentially pleasing to other people, right? There's a lot of times where like there's stuff that there's no reason for me to share, or I can share it in a way that is less aggressive or less combative or whatever else. But that's the time when I think about my life that I wasn't vulnerable, is when I was just doing sort of this like people pleasing parroting of ideas that or ways of speaking that I thought people wanted to hear.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap on this episode. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all the things to spread happiness in the world. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.